Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to SICSS West Central Africa, to our second virtual day. Our first 2 days are just going to be virtual, and then we'll start in person on Monday. Today, we're going to talk about ethics and watch some of the SICSS programming videos on ethics. After each video, we'll have a quick 5-minute discussion, and then after we watch all 3 videos, we'll have a discussion about some of the challenges behind data, access to research, who's able to do things, who's defining the conversation, and then talk a little bit about what we want as Cameroonians and as Africans in terms of data and things like that. So here's today's programming. Yes, so we'll start with the SICSS programming, and then we have some discussion questions that are based on these 4 points. So we'll talk about data, what topics are commonly researched, how different is the dominant paradigm under right now is a Western dominated academy compared to what it would be if research and discussions were led by us Africans, and then how should we be using data and conducting research. So we'll start with 3 videos. The videos are a little bit long, so we're going to watch them at a slightly quicker speed so we can get through them and have time for discussion, because we only want these virtual sessions to last about 1.5 to 2 hours. So we'll go ahead and start with video 1. If anyone has any questions or comments, just put them in the chat, and then generally we'll try to address them after the video is finished, and I may type a response if it's something quick and easy while the video is going.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Salganic, and in this lecture, this is part 1 of my lectures on ethics. So this covers the first half of material in chapter 6 of Bit by Bit. So I want to start with a claim, which is that computational social scientists should care about research ethics. This seems like kind of a silly claim. Of course, we should care about research ethics, but I want to argue that it's particularly important for computational social scientists. There are fear-based reasons. So first of all, none of us want to be in a position where we do something unethical. And in the time that I've seen, of the research I've seen in computational social science, it seems like many computational social scientists are much closer to ethical gray areas than they often realize. And so it's important for us to just, one, be afraid of ourselves making a mistake. And then also for the field, like as a whole, our field does not want to get tarnished by people who are doing things that are ethically unsound. And these fear-based reasons, we've heard about these more maybe in the debates around people calling out certain studies as being unethical. I also think there are really important hope-based reasons to focus and care about research ethics. And by this, what I mean is I think there's a lot of ethically sound, important, and interesting research that could happen, but is not currently happening because of all the ambiguity and concerns about research ethics. So to the extent that we as a community can come up with norms and standards and values that we all share, I think that will actually increase our chances of doing important and interesting research. And lastly, I think basically we have no choice. As I said earlier, I think all computational social scientists are much closer to ethical gray areas than they realize. And so if you're working in this area, you have to pay attention to research ethics. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to help you design ethically thoughtful research and then explain your decisions to others. And I think this part about explaining your decisions to others is especially important and one that doesn't get discussed as much. So let me elaborate on that a little bit. So as researchers, we often have to solve really hard problems. And then we explain how we solve those problems to other people so that as a community, we can learn and get better and better at solving problems. So with ethics, though, often we don't want to talk about how we solve those problems. We don't share our thinking. And so what that means is it's harder for us as a community to grow and improve our ethical practice. And so I think it's particularly important that not only are you able to think ethically for yourself, but you're able to explain your reasoning to other people. And if we get in the habit of talking about what we're doing, then I think we'll all be able to reason better and more thoughtfully and have the kind of debate that we have in other areas that helps us move forward as a field. So broadly speaking, I think there are kind of 2 main approaches to research ethics in computational social science. The first is a rules-based approach, and this is more common among people that have training as a social scientist. So this rules-based approach is generally focused on following what the IRB tells you to do. The IRB is the Institutional Review Board. These are bodies inside of US universities that enforce a set of rules that come from the US federal government about ethical research practice. And so for social scientists, there's often a strong focus on what the IRB allows and what those rules allow. Among data scientists, there's much less exposure to IRBs. And so there in data science, I often see what I would call more of an ad hoc approach. It's not that people don't think about ethics, but they often are thinking about it on their own in the absence of some well-developed framework and in the absence of some third-party oversight and in the absence of a larger community within which to have these discussions. And I think each of these approaches is limited. So the rules-based approach is limited because the rules that we follow are actually very, very slow to change and were written largely in a different era. So IRBs are not necessarily in the best position to make judgments about computational social science research. Another problem with the rules-based approach is that it makes it very hard to explain your reasoning to other people. So let's imagine you do a study and someone questions one of the decisions ethical decisions of your research. It's not a very convincing explanation to say, I did this because it's allowed by the rules. It's much better if you have a reason or a basis for the decision that you can explain. So rules-based approaches can struggle. Ad hoc approaches can also struggle. One reason is they're very difficult. So to think about these issues carefully and reason about them successfully is incredibly, incredibly difficult and time-consuming. And you don't want to be doing all of your ethical reasoning on your own, and it also prevents community standards from emerging. And so in chapter 6 of Bit by Bit, I advocate for what I call a principles-based approach, which is that we follow certain ethical principles. And the good news is that we don't have to make up those principles ourselves. Those have already been developed by the research ethics community. And so we can draw on the wisdom of those prior researchers to help inform our thinking going forward. So in order to discuss these ethical principles and the kinds of research ethics challenges that arise, I want to start by talking about 3 real computational social science studies that have been the subject of ethical commentary. So I picked these 3 studies for a couple of reasons. One is I think they're all interesting research. The second is I think they are all complex ethically. So I don't think it'd be very interesting if I picked 3 studies that were ethically horrible, because that doesn't leave a lot of room for thought and debate and discussion. So I think all of these studies are open to ethical interpretation in a way that I think is fruitful for our learning. And the third reason I picked these examples is that they illustrate many of the tensions and challenges that computational social scientists will face. So the first study I want to talk about is commonly referred to as emotional contagion. It's this paper, experimental evidence of massive scale emotional contagion through social networks. So in this paper, researchers, some of whom were at Cornell and some of whom were at Facebook, conducted an experiment on Facebook on the news feeds of hundreds of thousands of people. So in some conditions, participants had posts with positive words were more likely to get knocked out of their feed. And in other conditions, participants who had posts that had more negative words were more likely to get knocked out of their feed. And then the researchers were subsequently studying what kinds of posts people would make. So were people who had posts with positive words blocked out of their feed? Were those people more likely to make positive posts themselves or less likely to make negative posts? So this particular study, it happened without informed consent beyond the informed consent that takes place in the Facebook terms of service. It was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and immediately it generated a large outcry and debate. And subsequently, the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a note discussing some of the ethical issues with this study. It's also been debated subsequently in many papers. So that's one study. I want to tell you about a different study now. So this study was called Taste, Ties, and Time. This was a study conducted by researchers at a university, and those researchers and some students from that university scraped the profiles from Facebook for a specific class of students at that university. Then they combined the data from Facebook with data from the university about things like what classes the students had taken, where they lived on campus, merged these 2 things together, and then used that data set to conduct research about topics related to, for example, social networks, how they evolve, the relationship between social networks and behavior. Then the researchers took steps to anonymize the data and then make it available to other researchers. So this here is a paper describing the data set. This project was done under the review of the IRB, with the approval of the IRB at this university, and it also had the approval of Facebook. However, once the data was made available online, other researchers figured out that despite the steps that the original researchers had taken to anonymize the data, it was possible to identify the university and possible to identify some of the students in the data set. The data set was taken down and is now not available for use in research. So this study is different in that it doesn't involve an experiment. It involves actually just observing people's behavior. The third study I want to talk about is called Encore. So this one was conducted by some computer scientists. And what they were trying to do was to try to get measurements of the amount of web censorship that exists around the world. So in some parts of the world, certain websites are blocked by governments. And it's not clear which websites are blocked from which countries. And so how would you try to get a global measurement of web censorship? So what these researchers did is they created a snippet of code that someone could install inside of a web page. And then for example, let's imagine I put this snippet of code in my homepage. Then if you visited my homepage, this snippet of code triggers a request to these researchers' servers, which then triggers your browser to visit one of these potentially blocked sites. So it could be, for example, the website of a banned religious organization. Then they keep track of whether they are able to receive the answer from that website, and then that information goes back to the original researchers. So from the perspective of you as a user, your computer has now visited a potentially blocked website without your consent and without your awareness. So these researchers actually consulted with their institutional review board as well before launching the study. And that institutional review board said that this was actually not considered human subjects research under the definition of things that IRBs usually follow. So this particular paper was published in a computer science conference, but it was also published with a signing statement, ethical statement at the top of the paper, raising some issues with the decisions that were made in the paper. And so these are kind of three different examples that we've seen. So emotional contagion, taste, size, and time, Encore, all different ethical issues, but all real studies that were motivated by real research questions that led to debate. And so what's the challenge? What's the problem here? Why are we having these researchers who are well-meaning and well-intentioned? Why are we running into problems? And stepping back from these three studies, I think there's a more general problem going on. And part of the problem is that we have increased power. And so what do I mean by power? So as researchers, we now have the ability to observe the behavior of millions of people without their consent and without their awareness. Also, as researchers, we now have the capability to enroll millions of people in experiments, again, without their consent and without their awareness. And this kind of power is actually really new. Like social science researchers in the past have not had these capabilities, and now we really do have these capabilities. So we have these increased power, and yet at the same time, there's inconsistent and overlapping rules and norms and expectations about how this power should be used. It's ambiguous what we can and cannot do with this power. And this inconsistency comes from a variety of sources. I think three are most important. The first is that the rules are slow to change. So for example, the regulations that govern institutional review boards in the US, those recently underwent a modernization process, and that took more than 5 years. And so what that means is it's going to be very hard for the rules to continue to evolve as the technology continues to evolve. Second, there's little agreement about what are the key concepts that are often at stake. So privacy is a good example. So researchers who entirely focus their research on defining and understanding privacy do not agree on how privacy should even be defined. And so if experts in a field cannot come to some consensus, then it's very unlikely that empirical researchers and participants in studies will be able to come to a consensus as well. And the third reason for the inconsistency is that research is now happening in a blending of context. So let me explain what I mean there. So it used to be that the research context was relatively self-contained. So you would go into a psychology lab, do an experiment, and then leave the psychology lab. So when you're in that psychology lab, the rules of psychology labs apply. Increasingly, we're seeing experiments being done mixed into the normal everyday life of people. And so what rules then apply there? So a good example of this comes from emotional contagion. That experiment was done in the newsfeed of Facebook, and it was done by researchers, some of whom worked at Facebook and some of whom worked at Cornell. So in that blended context, which set of rules and norms should apply? Should it be the rules and norms of Cornell's IRB? Should it be the norms and rules of oversight of experimentation on Facebook? What about the expectations that people have? Should they be the expectations that they have when they participate in a scientific research study? Or should it be the expectations they have when they go on Facebook and look at their newsfeed? So the blending of context makes it very difficult to establish clear norms and expectations. And so what we have is increasing power, inconsistent ideas about how that power should be exercised, and this creates a problem. And this is what I think a lot of researchers face. They have to figure out how to deal with this set of issues. And so what I'm going to argue for is a way of thinking about this that I hope will be useful to you. And the idea is that rather than thinking about the rules, which I said is where I think many social scientists start, I think we're better off abstracting a bit to the principles that were used to derive those rules. And these principles are less specific than the rules. And that's a good thing because it helps us then reason about situations for which they didn't exist. with which the rules haven't yet been created. And these principles themselves actually can be derived from some ethical frameworks. So I think moving away from the rules more towards principles and ethical frameworks will help us reason about a much wider range of situations and will also help us communicate our reasoning with others. Okay, so the good news is that we don't have to make up these principles. We don't have to make up these ethical frameworks. This work has already been done for us. And so I'm going to advocate for following a set of 4 ethical principles, 3 of which were written down in the Belmont Report, which was a landmark report about research ethics done in the US in the 1970s. This is the report that eventually led to the common rule and the IRBs as we know them today. And then, so that the Belmont Report laid out 3 principles that are, I think, well known to social scientists: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So those are the 3 principles in the Belmont Report. Then there's a 4th principle that I'm going to advocate for, which comes from a different report called the Menlo Report. So this was commissioned by also the US government, and it was commissioned in part because of ethical uncertainty and ethical problems in research done by computer scientists. And so they said, let's come up with a report to help guide ethics of research focusing on information technology. And so the Menlo Report authors reaffirmed the 3 Belmont principles and then added a 4th principle: respect for law and public interest. And so now what I'm going to do is talk about each of those 4 principles, a little bit about it, and how it can help you guide your research. So the first principle I want to talk about is respect for persons. And so generally what this means is that participants decide, not you. So this is the key idea: is you want to respect the autonomy of your participants, meaning giving them the power to decide whether to participate or not. And then this is often converted into the idea that we know of as informed consent. So informed consent is a way of operationalizing the idea of respect for persons. The second principle is beneficence. And so beneficence is about minimizing risks of studies, maximizing the benefits, and then deciding whether the study should go forward. So minimizing the risks: have you done everything you can to minimize the risks to your participants? Maximizing the benefits: again, have you done everything you can to maximize the benefits? And so these 2 things are often require technical expertise, and often researchers are in the best position to know about them. For a given study, are there small changes you can make that would alter the balance here? And then once you've done all that technical work of minimizing the risks and maximizing the benefits, there's a second thing. And that second thing is deciding whether the study should still go forward. And so in my experience, actually, technical expertise is sometimes not very helpful in this second step. So in IRBs in the United States, they all are required to have people who are non-researchers serve on them. I've served on the IRB at Princeton University. We had non-researchers on the IRB. For example, we had a minister. And I found it very interesting that the minister would often ask different questions and bring a different point of view to the study. And so I think it's especially important. This also brings up an important dimension of research ethics, which is the idea of third-party oversight. And so here the question is, who should be in a position to make these decisions? So should it be the researcher, or should it be some third party, someone other than the researcher? And a very important reason that third party oversight can be helpful is that researchers are often the worst people to assess whether the risks and benefits are in balance. So most research only happens if you believe it is incredibly important. Like, research involves a lot of self-delusion to thinking that what you're doing is so important. And that's true for my research too. Like, we have to believe that what we're doing is incredibly important. And so if you are in a position where you believe what you're doing is incredibly important, that raises questions about whether you're in the best position to decide whether the risks and benefits of the study are in appropriate balance. So that's beneficence. The third principle from the Belmont Report is justice. So justice is about the distribution of burdens and benefits of research. And so it used to be the case that a lot of medical research involved poor people, and a lot of the benefits of that medical research flowed to rich people. And so that somehow seems out of balance. Like, what we would like is that the benefits and burdens of research are distributed in a way that's fair. And I think here it's particularly important to note that many of the research ethics failures of scientists have happened with very disadvantaged populations. So poorly educated and disenfranchised citizens, prisoners, institutionalized and mentally disabled children, old and debilitated hospital patients. The list of research ethics failures that scientists have done, it seems to almost always involve these very disadvantaged populations. I think that is something that we have to keep in mind whenever we're doing our work. If we are working with one of these disadvantaged populations, we have to ask ourselves, is this consistent with the principles of justice? Now, there's a debate within the justice literature also about overly protective view of research ethics. And so it's also the case that sometimes populations at high risk also need access to the benefits of research. So for example, there was a time where a lot of medical research screened out pregnant women. And the idea was that this would be trying to minimize the risk, but then they realized that pregnant women were then shut out of a lot of the benefits of research that could be helpful to pregnant women. Similar to children, often we don't want to include children in research studies, but also children need the benefits that can come from scientific research happening with their particular population. So within justice, it's not just about protection, it's also about access. And getting the balance between protection and access can be tricky. So let's take an example with Encore. So the people who are potentially put most at risk during Encore are people who are living in societies with repressive governments. And so you might imagine that when designing the study, we should try to prevent people from those countries from participating. On the other hand, those are the societies where potentially these measurements of internet censorship are most important and most valuable. And so here we see a real tension between the desire to protect people from the risks of research with ensuring that they have access to the benefits of the knowledge that comes from that research. So the fourth principle, which comes from the Menlo Report, is respect for law and public interest. And so what this means is they interpret it to mean two different things. One is compliance, so this means follow the laws. And then the second is transparency-based accountability. And this generally means be open and honest about what you're doing. So we can think of both of these in the context of emotional contagion. So compliance means follow the laws. So there are questions about whether Facebook's terms of service covers research like the research that happened. There are also questions about whether, in terms of compliance, whether all research should be governed by the common rule or not. There was a debate about whether there's a law in the state of Maryland that meant all research, even if it wasn't funded by the federal government, should be governed by the common rule. Then there are other people who say that law in the state of Maryland is actually not constitutional. And so compliance actually is quite difficult for researchers because it's often very tricky to follow all of the laws, especially for research that's at a global scale. So Encore, for example, involved participants from, I think, more than 150 countries. So it'd be virtually impossible for a researcher to ensure that what they're doing is in compliance with the laws of all of those countries. The second part of respect for law and public interest is transparency-based accountability. And so here the idea is that basically you should not be doing stuff in secret. You should try to make what you're doing open and available to people and subject yourself to oversight that comes from that. So here, I think emotional contagion is actually a very positive example. So they published their work in a journal, they made it available open access, and that meant that everyone in the world had access to see what they had done, which allowed for a certain amount of accountability. Now, if Facebook had done that study and not published it, we would have less insight into what they are doing, and so there's less oversight and accountability of what's happening. So those are the two ways that people think about respect for law and public interest. So overall, these are the four principles that I have described: respect for persons, beneficence, justice, respect for law and public interest. Then a very important question is, how do we balance these four principles? Because often they come into conflict. And the answer is that it's very difficult. So the first thing to keep in mind, though, is that no one principle dominates the other principles. So often informed consent is treated as if it is like one thing above all other things. And that's not really right. We have to realize that all of these principles involve trade-offs, and different designs are better or worse at different dimensions. So one way that I like to think about it is, and that how do you strike the right balance between these principles varies from case to case. So let's take case ties and time. So in that study, you could argue that by making the data available to other researchers, they were improving the benefits that came from that study. On the other hand, they were also increasing the risks to participants. And so there you have a tension. How do you manage that tension? That involves trade-offs. And so there is no simple formula for how to balance these principles. It's something that has to be done in a case-by-case basis. And often you'll see sometimes there's something that would improve you along one dimension that would cause a trade-off along another dimension. So when making these trade-offs and balancing between these principles, I think there are two ethical frameworks that help us understand these principles a little bit better and reason about the trade-offs. And these two ethical frameworks are consequentialism and deontology. So consequentialism, most associated with philosophers like John Stuart Mill, and this generally focuses on the end. So we say we should take an action if it leads to better ends in the world. A different school of ethical thought called deontology is associated with philosophers like Immanuel Kant, and there they generally focus on the means. So we should take actions that have good means independent of the ends that they lead to. And so these two ethical frameworks are themselves kind of in conflict. One focuses on means, one focuses on ends. And I think there are a few things to keep in mind about both of these frameworks. First is that both of these approaches can be taken to extremes. So a pure extreme form of consequentialism can require us to, let's say, take me, I have a bunch of healthy organs, so I should go to the hospital and then a doctor should cut me up and take all of my organs and transplant them into other people. And so by taking me and cutting me up, we might be able to save 6 patients. And so a strong consequentialist would argue, extreme consequentialist would argue that we have an ethical obligation to cut me up for my organs. So that doesn't seem right, that we have this obligation to cut people up and transplant their organs away. Likewise, a very extreme form of deontology also leads to kind of perverse decisions. So imagine that I had planted a bomb on campus and I knew where this bomb was, and if I didn't reveal its location, hundreds of people would die. So extreme deontologists would argue that we should not even lie in the process of trying to learn about the location of this bomb. And that also seems a little bit like maybe not the wisest way of approaching this. And so both of these approaches can be taken to an extreme. And so if you find yourself having one of these approaches about a particular study, if you find yourself having a very consequentialist approach, if you find yourself having a very deontological approach, remember that taken to an extreme, that approach leads to perverse kinds of decisions. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that most of the ethical disagreements I've seen among computational social scientists are among people taking these different frameworks, different points of view. So for example, I've heard someone say, oh, look at all of the benefits that will come from this study. And then someone else says, no, but look, there was no informed consent from the participants. And then the original person says, yes, but look at all the benefits. And so here what you have is you have one person who's arguing from a very consequentialist perspective focused on the benefits. You have one person who's focused on a very deontological perspective focused on the means, and they're just completely missing each other. And so if you find yourself in a discussion about the studies of a particular, about the ethics of a particular piece of research, try to take a moment and see whether you're in a consequentialist frame or a deontological frame. And if you are, and the other person is in the other frame, try to switch for a second. Try to take a moment and put yourself into their frame and try to talk about it from within their frame. That's much more likely to reach consensus, or at least much more likely to understand the nature of agreements. Okay, so in this video, I've talked about moving from a rules-based approach to following more of the principles that were used to derive those rules. And then when we have to find balance between these principles, moving to the ethical frameworks from which those principles were derived. Now, applying all of these ideas can be really tricky in practice. And so in part 2, I'll discuss 4 areas of difficulty, and I'll offer 3 practical suggestions. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I think we should jump directly into the discussion so we don't take too much of our time. Watching these videos. So I prepared a series of slides that will guide our discussion, and we'll talk about things that are relevant to computational social science, data science, and then Cameroon and Africa broadly. So I invite everyone to participate. And you can participate either via unmuting or you can type in the chat. And so it's not something we really have to raise our hands and take turns for, because it's a very equal discussion. And so I want to start the discussion with talking about data in Africa. And I have 3 pictures here that talk about distinctly different things that are related to data in Africa. And so the first picture at the very top right is a data center. And data centers obviously house data for a lot of different sources. So the government can have data centers. Big companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google can have data centers. And they're very complicated networks, and they take a lot of energy and a lot of money to maintain, but they do have a lot of benefits. And that's where a lot of the world's data comes from. Then we have a picture of a telephone, which is a way in which we can get data here in African countries right now, since we don't necessarily have the infrastructure and the money to build big data centers yet. And we had the example that we had seen yesterday in that research paper where in Rwanda, when they were trying to calculate people's income status, they were using cell phone data or cell phone metadata from these tech companies. And then in the bottom right corner is a situation where the Chinese government actually gifted the African Union a building in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, but the building was bugged. So they were able to get a lot of inside information and data. And so these are three possible things we can talk about in reference to data in Africa. And so I invite people to give their opinions on what they think about either one of these three different sources of data. Is anyone here interested in using cell phone data in a similar way to how it was used in the presentation yesterday? I'm not sure if people are accidentally on mute while trying to speak. Yes, Steve.
Yes, I believe given the resources we have here, it will be easier for us to use data from mobile phone. But I don't know how it's going to happen. Is there any application needed to collect data? And also, I heard during the presentation, they say that, for example, in the for Facebook, they need to have the approval of Facebook. Now, if we are going to use data from mobile phones, how are we going to get that approval? Are we supposed to get the approval from the mobile app? I mean the social network, or from the user himself? So these are some of questions that I can have concerning the data collection from mobile phone.
Yes, that's a good question. And so in reference to how we would get mobile phone data, so there's a few different ways you can go about it. If you're talking about strictly data that's related to people's mobile phone usage, the characteristics of the people who have the mobile phone, we would have to go through the phone companies like Airtel, MTN, Camtel, etc. And they would have to give us either access to the website where they house all the data, or they would have to download the data files and give them to us directly. For Google and Twitter and other social media or other online websites, you can actually create what they call a research profile. And that gives you the ability to go on and search and what they call it scrape or take the data that you want. And so there will be one day next week where we actually go through the process of taking data online from Twitter. And then you can also get data from things like newspaper articles. And so if you want to look at, for example, a study where you see how the state-sponsored media is talking about a particular issue, you can there's a website you can go to that will search all of their recent articles and then download and compile all of those into one document. The way it compiles it is a little bit complicated, and you may have to do a little bit of moving around, but those are ways in which you can scrape online data for free without having access to the same kind of infrastructure, or without having these big government agencies that just give out free data like we have in the US. What do people think about the particular issue of the Chinese bugging the African Union Center that they donated? Does anyone have any thoughts about what kind of data they would be wanting to get from this particular building they gifted? And you can always just unmute and begin speaking. Well, I think in the situation of this building, the kind of data they're going to be wanting to get is obviously to spy on what people are doing. And so one way they can bug the building is they can put recorders inside of the seats, which is what I believe they did. So you can get audio data from what's going on in this particular building. And then they can get either transcribers, which are people who listen to the audio and then write out the text, or there's actually software they can do that too. I'm not sure if they've developed it to work in a situation like that, because whenever you have audio and then transcribing software, it usually only works for target populations. And so in the US, you can have an audio file with multiple different people speaking, and when the software does it, there's an error rate. And so usually that software works best on white people from certain parts of the country. And then the farther that you deviate away from that population, the less accurate it becomes. And in a situation where you have an African Union building where you have to deal with people who are not only speaking multiple languages, but then multiple different accents, it would be really hard to have a software that does that. And so that would be one limitation that the Chinese would face when they try to get that kind of data. So they would most likely have to hire people who are personal transcribers. They can also build the computers, which is what I believe they did too. And so any file that's coming in and out of the computers, any email, things that people look up, things that people watch, those are all sources of data that they can take and then use, upload it or send it to China, etc. And so do people has anyone yet compiled any thoughts about what they think about the African Union building being bugged by the Chinese? There is one comment. Can we use a free data available on the web to make a research accepted in any good journal? For example, a data set on eMarket. Yes. So any data that you find online that's free, open source, etc., you can use in research publications. There's a lot of different sources of data. So you can get data from Twitter, you can get data from Google. In the United States, many different government agencies release data. The World Bank releases free data as well. The UN releases free data. There's things like the Demographic Health Survey that you can download for free. And so there's a lot of access to data that people can use if they're living in the continent, that they don't have to go and collect themselves, or they don't have to rely on public service agencies to get that data. So hopefully that answers the question. Does anyone have any other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. And then in the context of data centers, I think it'd be useful for us to talk about these as well. And so data centers contain a large number of computers and drives that are interconnected that allow them to not only store originals of information, but then they store backups. So for example, if you make a Facebook profile, there's some data center around the world that has your profile stored in it. And then there's another data center or another spot in the same data center that has a copy of that information. And when you, even though the amount of data that you're using for one singular profile is very small, when you have billions of different accounts that you're trying to store data on with numerous different pieces of data, then it becomes really difficult. And then these companies are generally storing big amounts of data that aren't even necessary that you put something into the profile. So if you have a WhatsApp account, whenever you create it, they obviously have your name, your phone number, but they do gather other different types of data based on that as well. Whenever you use these social media sites or these apps, there are terms and conditions that you have to accept to use them that nobody reads. They gives them access to do things like sometimes they can look at your search history, they can look at your web history, they can store variables, they can store data based on all of those things. And so the data sets become really, really big. There's a question in the chat that says the African Union being bugged by the Chinese. I wish to ask how exactly the issue was handled. Was it considered a huge crime or was it just ignored? So I don't know too much about the specifics of the aftermath, but I do know that eventually people did find out. They went through and they debugged the entire building. And then some of the services that were done in relation to the computers, maintenance, data storage, et cetera, were taken from the Chinese companies and then put into like African-based companies or under African-based watch leadership, et cetera. I don't think that it was, I mean, I personally think it's a big crime, but how much power do you have to go against the Chinese government? How much power do you have over the media to make it a big deal? Especially if a lot of countries have if a lot of African countries have debt from China, there's only so much you can do, even if it is a huge crime. So I think you could think of it as being ignored. Here's another question. It is an offense to wiretap the administration or illegally record information. For example, the case of the UA. Can we ask the return and deletion of these recordings? So you can request the deletion of recordings or the deletion of data that they stole from the computers. And the Chinese can say that they deleted it, but the nature in which data works, it would be impossible to guarantee that they've done that. So for example, they can have a very high security hidden data center where they're keeping all that data. So even if we were to send a team to China to check out all their government information database, which is not possible, even if we were to make that possible, you would still never find that off the grid data set. So once they have the data, it's kind of almost impossible to guarantee that that data will ever go away. Here's a response. Yeah, I agree. It is like most of the crimes perpetrated by third world countries against Africa ignored. At least the matter was noticed. Yes, so when it comes to cybercrime, cyber activity, or anything related to data and theft, everything usually just gets ignored for the most part, unless you're a super powerful country like the US. And even if you're super powerful, you can't really fight against these guys. There are situations even in the US where there are hackers off the grid who will either hack. For example, there was a building, there was some kind of agency that controls access to oil in the US, and that agency was hacked. And there was a ransom where they had to pay billions of dollars to get the thing back. And the US government had a really, really hard time trying to find and get those people. There are governments that try to hack each other, for example, the US and Russia or Russia and China. And so cybercrimes in general go ignored or like let's just say there's no really retaliation in many cases, but definitely in African countries, I can see that happening a lot because there's not probably a super trained unit that African governments use to go investigate these kind of things. During the works about African borders, what examples of data sets will be used? So for that particular project, we would actually have to create a data set. And I think that's what would make our project unique and what would make our project very high impact. So there's not really a set method to determining what factors are most important for nation building. I mean, when you look at most country borders, all those borders that were drawn in South America, Africa, even in places like Southeast Asia were all written by those white people arbitrarily. And even the borders in the white countries, the Arab countries, those borders are forged not necessarily off of using some kind of rationality or justification, but based on like previous empires or who took over who fights who takes what land from who. So this would actually probably be a first, actually thinking about borders from a way that makes sense with justification, some kind of empiricism. So what I think we would have to do for a data set like that is find a unit of analysis that makes sense. So if we're trying to redraw country borders, we can't really use country borders as a unit of analysis. We'd probably want to use cities, towns, villages, and we would try to figure out attributes that we think are representative of what's important to decide nation borders. And then we would have to fill in that data set somehow. So that's the general idea of what we'll have to use for that data set. But moving on, there is one piece of data that I think is super important in the development of Cameroon and then other African countries in general. This picture kind of gives an idea of what that is. And it's the idea of identification of persons and then being able to track persons. I think people sometimes assume that the government may want to use this data against people, but without a national identification system, it makes it really hard for you to know how many people are in the country, what are the attributes of these people, what's the in and out migration. And without these numbers, it's really hard for you to do planning. So how can you figure out how many schools are needed? How do you know whether or not you need to build roads, et cetera? If the Cameroon government doesn't know how many people are migrating in and out of Douala every day, it's going to be very hard for them to say, this is the appropriate road we need that's going into the rural part of the country, for example. It makes it really hard for you to know how many students are going to be in public schools. So figuring out how to build those, it's going to make it really hard to do a lot of things. And accompanied with a system like this, where we're able to kind of track and know where people are, we also want to have some kind of, in the US, we have what's called like a social security system. So there's a number that you can use to track the way that people interact with each other financially. So when you're renting a place, that goes to the social security number. That way, when the new renter, the new person or the new proprietor who's giving out the apartment, they can see the previous history of the person and decide to accept or reject them. And then you can also find them based on that number, and then you can sue them in court to get the money back. So having these kind of identification systems, having these kind of ways to track people, and having that data gives you the ability to develop, because if you can't do business with people and you can't hold people accountable, it's going to be really hard for you to develop and intensify and build a lot of wealth in the country in a way that places that are developed like the US, Canada have done. There's one question that says, is there software to protect data on servers? Yes. Now that's something that's more related to computer science, so I don't know too much about it, but in general, there's different techniques I believe they use to protect data. So you can do what's called encryption. And encryption is a process where you create like a scrambled code that is extremely hard to figure out, that's super long, tedious, something that not a normal computer can figure out, and you put all the data behind it. And the only way to unlock it is if you have the key to that encryption. Then people hire cybersecurity, IT people, information technology people to do all the behind the scenes to protect this data on the servers. And then also people split data up. So you can have some data on one server, some data on the other server, but this is a question I don't want to answer too much because I don't know the specifics on it, and it kind of goes beyond what we're talking about here. So does anyone have any comments or discussion points they want to in relation to the identification system things I was talking about? Or should we move on? Okay. So I have some questions here on this slide for people. So some questions I want to ask are, what topics do people usually see studied in Cameroon and in Africa? And what's the dominant paradigm when you see these things being studied? Are the topics representative of the issues that you think are important in Cameroon and Africa? And do you think that the perspectives that the general paradigm, the current paradigms have are accurate? or do you think they're inaccurate from a Cameroonian or from an African perspective? Does anyone have any answers? Well, I think this is a very important question because it's going to be important for the skills that you're developing. And so when we think about the things that are most researched in the Cameroon and the African context, it's generally going to be things related to health, education, nutrition, agriculture. But I think the current paradigm is based on lack, I guess is the best way to put it. So people see all these problems going on in Cameroon, all these problems going on in African countries, and that dictates the topics that we're researching in that context. And so that dictates a lot of the data that's available. And one of the problems with that is if people in Cameroon or people in African countries think that we should be shifting our approach towards researching other things that we think have a better investment outcome in terms of development, then you're going to have a lot of problem trying to do that research because of the topics that are already being researched, the data that's available, the paradigms that people set. There's one comment. So I think it's all topics related to AI. Okay. So I haven't seen, is there a lot of research that you've seen that's done in artificial intelligence in Cameroon and Africa? Or is that the kind of research that you would find more important? Someone says they disagree. I personally haven't seen too much research related to AI in African countries, except for things like surveillance technology from the Chinese that African governments may be using. Can you add some clarification about the topics of AI that you've seen research done in Africa? Okay, Felicitas says, I think most of the research, as you said, is towards poverty, healthcare, and mostly from a place of lack. And as I said before, that dictates a lot of the data that's gathered about African countries. And so you generally have things like the demographic health survey. You have the researchers coming in, figuring out how many people are lacking food, what kind of food are people eating, how often are people eating, what kind of agricultural crops are there. And that makes it really hard for priorities of different approaches to take place. So I have some questions here that talk about data, but if you're gathering data from a place of lack, let's say, for example, that Cameroonians agree that entrepreneurship is the key to the problems that the country's facing. The kind of data that's being collected, the current paradigm makes it really hard to do research. And instead you should be offering, for example, data that answers questions like, what type of food do Cameroonians want to eat the most? What type of food has the best market value? What type of food can we grow the highest yield for the cheapest prices for? That kind of data exists, but it's not as easy, it's not accessible, and it makes it really hard to take a different approach towards doing research that people within the country may want to do. So I have some questions here that we can think about. Right now, how is data in general being used by people who are actually living in Cameroon and in African countries? Is the government using this data? Do African-based NGOs have access to this data? And then how much do individuals like researchers or policy institute figures or even students have access to the data? Does anyone have any answers to these questions or discussion points they want to discuss related to these?
Um, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'd like to ask how much access do local NGOs in African countries have? I think the access to the data is quite limited because mostly if the data is even done physically, it's still difficult to actually get it effectively. And when it's done maybe digitally on the phone or computers, on the internet, they still don't have access to those tools in general. So I think access is pretty limited, the NGOs in African countries.
Yes, thank you for that comment. I think there's a lot of ways in which data has to be collected. And then also there's ways in which data has to be collected for it to be useful. And so next week, we'll talk about the idea of what kind of data is useful, but in general, you want to have data that's what they call representative to the population. So if you're doing research in Cameroon on, let's say, phone use, you don't want to do research in Cameroon just in Douala or just in one of the smaller towns or villages, because that's going to give you a biased view as to what's going on in the entirety of the country representatively. And so one of the challenges, for example, is making sure that you have representative data. As said before, we don't have a very strong identification system, a way of tracking people, knowing how many people are in the country. And so it makes it really hard for you to sample throughout the country and make sure the data is representative. And as Felicitas said, you have to get data from phones. If everyone doesn't have a smartphone, that makes things much more difficult. If you're doing data in person, then you have to do data entry into the computer. You have to organize the data, find a place to store the data, find a way to access the data. And because at each one of those levels, things are going to get harder and you're going to miss sources of data. It's going to be really hard. And so in general, if we don't have strong social institution, public political institution that does this, and if it's not easy for people in the private sector to do this, and it's not easy for the normal person to do this, and you don't have a lot of money to go through and survey these people and make sure that it's easy, then no one's really going to have access to good data. I'm curious, do people think that the government has good access to data in the country, or do you think that they're working on getting better access to data, or do you think they over rely on institutions like the World Bank or the UN to provide good data?
I think the Cameroon government is doing their best, but I don't believe the Cameroonian citizens themselves are ready to even provide this data. For instance, when they were carrying out surveys about the COVID-19 and stuff, most people ignored maybe the messages by the government, but on another level, they also depended on the World Health Organization to help them get this data. So overall, I think they're doing the best, but somehow they're still depending on these big organizations for help. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Yes, I definitely agree. I've seen that in Cameroon, they started giving out the biometric ID, biometric passport. They've passed standards on making sure that things get done on a certain time scale. But there's also the level of people being willing to give data and information. And I think this is not just a problem in Cameroon, but in countries in general. You even see at the university in the US I'm studying now, they release surveys, people never really want to fill them out. And there's a lot of reasons and things that you have to think about in research in relation to those things. So you have to think, how long is the survey? How much out of their way do people have to go to fill out the survey? Are they happy with the people who are giving out the survey? Do they think the survey is important? Can you compensate people for filling out surveys? These are all questions. Even on the survey itself, are you asking questions that people interpret correctly? Are you asking questions that accurately give people the ability to answer what you're trying to get out. These are all things that are super important in getting data. And so it's good that we're bringing these things up and thinking about these things as we're working on this kind of training. There was 2 comments in the chat box. One says, yes, the topics can be transposed with the research carried out in Cameroon. What exactly do you mean by transposed? And there's another comment that says the data is really restricted according to its sensitivity and the level of clearance. So that's definitely true. And in general, you'll see that when it comes to data, at least I know here in the US, they are pretty okay with releasing data or giving people access to data, especially if they're researchers working at policy institutes. The only thing that they want to kind of protect is making sure that people's identities aren't being leaked. And as related to those three ethical principles, you want to make sure that that information can't be used against people. So if someone's giving out a data set based on how people are building their houses, how much value their house has, how many people are living in their house, they want to make sure that they try to remove identifiers that give you the ability to take the data and then retrace back who that person is. So there are situations where, you know, depending on the sensitivity, the ease and ability of being able to do that, that they're going to restrict data more than other forms of data. Yeah, so are there any other comments or questions related to this one, or we can move on? Okay. So I'm curious, how do people here think that data should be used, and what would they like to see in reference to data collected on Cameroonians and Africans in general? So are there any particular data that people would like to see collected in Cameroon that they don't see collected so far?
Okay, I would like to kind of refer back to the point you made. The one part of data that is not collected here in Cameroon, especially, is what do Cameroonians actually like to eat? Because I've noticed that Cameroonians are very much interested in the consumption of fast foods, but I don't think we have the variety. We have what is needed here in Cameroon. And that's because people don't ask, and therefore they cannot provide what they don't know. So yeah, that's data that should be collected.
Yes, that's interesting to bring up, because data as to the kind of food that Cameroonians want to eat is something that you could possibly collect from different sources. So let's say the Ministry of Public Health wants to figure out how they should plan around, because eating fast food is bad for your health, at least the population effects, and we see that in countries that have fast food. You see it in Asia, you see it in the Middle East, you see it in the West. And so if the Ministry of Public Health wants to try to predict when people are going to start eating fast food and put in preventative measures to stop big health problems from coming, then they would collect data on what kind of food Cameroonians prefer to eat to get a sense of when that's going to happen. Another way that you could do this is individual private sector people who are wanting to get into business in Cameroon. So if you have someone with a lot of money who wants to open up a fast food restaurant, or if they want to figure out a restaurant they can open to make a lot of money, then you're going to want to go and sit down and do surveys with people in Cameroon to figure out, okay, this is the food we have here. Are there other possible types of food that people will eat? And when you're trying to collect data, sometimes things are not necessarily straightforward. So if you ask someone, what do you prefer to eat? The kind of answers you're going to get can be varied. So people could think that you're just referring to the food that they're already eating usually. So if someone asks me, what food do I prefer to eat? I would just tell them what my favorite dish in Cameroon is. Or they could say, I saw this on TV and I want to eat this. But the way that people interpret that kind of data, or the way people interpret that kind of question can be varied. And that's something I referenced before. You have to be really careful when you're asking questions on surveys to make sure that you're getting your point across, that people are interpreting things correctly, et cetera. But one way you could get this data is by creating a representative list of fast foods that are common, maybe not in Cameroon, but in other places like burger, fried chicken, pizza. And you can go survey people and ask them on a scale of 1 to 5, how much of this food do you want to eat? This food do you want to eat? This food do you want to eat? Etc. And you can even ask them other prices like, how much would you be willing to pay for this food? And creating these surveys gives you the ability to start creating these big data sets that you can start using. Are there any other kind of data sets that people would like, or any other kind of data or information that people would like to see collected in Cameroon? Or even data that we should improve?
Okay, I would just like to add this. I don't know if it's the whole sector that is being ignored, but I've noticed like on social media platforms like TikTok, most often Americans, they go out and then they ask the citizens if they'll prefer to consume maybe products that are more sustainable, and if they're ready to pay for those products, like, yeah, products that are more sustainable, or those that are less sustainable for a cheaper price. I think that's data that maybe should be collected here in Cameroon, because I think that's an area actually that is neglected, which is why much data hasn't even been collected about it. I mean, the whole sustainability area, nobody has really done anything, or little has been done when it comes to it. So I think maybe data should be collected in that area too.
Yes. And so I'm glad you brought that point up. That's actually an innovative way that we can get new data. And so when it comes to getting data on people's opinions, it's very expensive. And as we talked about before, when you give surveys out to people, they don't listen, they don't take the survey. And so you have to hire people to put out those surveys. If you're doing it on paper and you're mailing it out to people, it costs a lot of money. And so it's really, really hard to do these surveys at a large scale. It's really hard to do these surveys, get representative population, and it's really hard to just do the survey in general. And in the case of what you mentioned with TikTok, I'm not sure if you can take data from TikTok the same way you can with Twitter, but one innovative way you can get data is, let's say, for example, that we know a large number of people from Cameroon are using Twitter. And if you create a trending hashtag or a trending topic and you ask people their opinion on sustainability, you can go mine and take all the responses to those tweets. Or you can take information about the likes, the number of retweets, the number of quote tweets. Of course, this is not necessarily ideal because you don't know, one, whether or not everyone in Cameroon is participating in this. Two, you don't know if it's biased because maybe only a certain type of people use Twitter, maybe only a certain age group uses Twitter, or only a certain people of education use Twitter, or only people who live in a certain area use Twitter. So those are some of the challenges you would face in using an innovative approach like that to getting data, but it is possible. And so I think in the case of Cameroon or other African countries, it'll be a long time before we start getting those data sets that we require surveys and things like that, because they're very resource intensive, they cost a lot of money, and they take a lot of time. There's one comment in the chat, I think that the use of data depends on what we are looking for, whatever the field we're in. Yes. And so I think one thing that would serve Cameroon very well is that we know what things we want to improve in the country. We kind of know the way we want to improve them, but there's no place where I can think of that you can go in Cameroon or go on the website of Cameroon and say, these are the particular types of data that we want to collect. It seems that in general, this is not just a Cameroon problem or an African country problem, but just a general problem. Usually countries are only collecting data that relates to things like the census or a particular initiative they're doing or a specific survey for something big like the COVID. You don't see situations where, or in the case of Cameroon or African countries, the only data they're getting are data where the researchers come from the UN or the researchers come from the World Health Organization, or people are posting that kind of data online. There needs to be a more concerted effort to kind of define what kind of data Cameroon needs, put that out there in a public way, and then see if there's innovative ways people can either go get the data. There's competitions we can do to give people money to get the data. We can find ways to support people to get the data and other things. So are there any other comments or questions people have on this? Oh, there's one in the chat. How can the data be used? So there's multiple ways in which you can use data. Oh, we haven't answered that. So we'll go back before we. So when it comes to using data, there's multiple different ways you can use it. So this is a computational social science training program. And so in general, the kind of methods we're using are to either predict outcomes or to create complex models to figure out what's going to happen in the future. So if we have data, for example, on how many people are migrating in and out of Cameroon, just a basic number, you're going to try to use that data to predict, okay, this is what the Cameroon population is going to look like in 10 years, because we know there's a net influx of people. And then we know that the Cameroon population, natural population, the average woman is having 4 kids or 5 kids. So you're trying to create an idea of predicting what the population will be in the future. You can also use data in a static sense. So you can try to use data to figure out what's going on in the current present. So if you have enough money to survey, or if you have enough money to collect information on 3 million people in Cameroon instead of 30 million, what you can do is do a representative data collection, and then you can try to extrapolate those numbers to say, well, we know that this small proportion of population has this characteristic. It's representative of the population, so we can make an inference about what things look like at the population level. You can also use data to go back and see things in the past, but I don't think that's necessarily something that's really important for us right now. But in a situation, you can think, if we're trying to figure out why did the GDP drop 10 years ago, and we weren't really paying attention back then, we can trace the data back and find out that there was a particular crop that failed in the country, or there was a particular political event that we didn't notice that happened in France or that happened in the Middle East or something like that. And then the people who are using the data is super important to understand as well. So the government can be using the data to plan for the economy, to plan for education, plan for infrastructure. The government can be used by the private sector to learn about people's preferences, to figure out which product to put to market. Data can be used by foreign governments to try to spy on people, figure out how they're going to make money from other countries, take advantage of them. So there's a variety in ways in which data can be used. And then even individual people can use data. So if individual people want to learn more about the country, if individual people want to go in and make money from business, there's all different kinds of ways data can be used. And so not just in computational social science, but there's other methods you can use, like interviews. You can use geographic data. Someone had asked a question about that yesterday. So you can take data from maps and you can look at them in layers. There's multiple different ways you can use the data. So hopefully that gives an idea. And this last slide of discussion here is to ask, how much do you think people have access to these kind of skills now? So how well do you think Africans are being trained to understand and be able to use the data? How well do you think the foreign education system is doing with this? How well do you think the Cameroon government trains civil servants to do this? And do you think that there's adequate opportunities for African youth to take part? What do people think about these questions? And so far, we've only had a few people responding, so we want to try to get everyone involved. Has anyone seen a program like this happen in Cameroon before, where they learn methods of data science, computational social science? Are these, because I grew up in the US, so I'm not really sure. I go back to Cameroon, but I don't spend too much time there. So has anyone seen any other programs like this? You can even just type yes or no in the chat. There's no other programs. Has anyone seen in the formal education system in Cameroon? So if you go to university or in high school, are trainings on data science, computational science, computational social science, are they common? Or is this all your first introduction to this particular type of skills? This is your first introduction. Okay, yes. And someone said the data on Africans is statistically unfavorable, usually a negative description of the social and economic environment. But I've learned a little bit about data collection and usage. So I'll talk first about the introduction. So yes, these skills are not introduced to people that much at all. I'm sure in Cameroon and even in the US, only very small people have access to this kind of thing. And the skills are portrayed as extremely difficult, very hard to grasp, but I think it's definitely possible for everyone to do, and people in Cameroon are really talented and they can easily understand these things. In fact, some of the ideas and intuitions behind what we're doing in computational social science are things that you naturally do in your head already. So one way, for example, to think about it is if you go to different parts of Douala all the time and you eat at restaurants all throughout the city over the course of 10 years, in your brain, you're already figuring out, I can cluster different parts of the city and I can cluster different foods. So I can say that this part of the city is cheaper than this part of the city. This part of the city is more expensive than this part of the city. And you know the variables as to why that's happening. You know the type of food, how many people live in that area, what the development of that area looks like. Is it advanced like Bona Prizo or Aqua, or is it new like Yasa? So these are things that you're already naturally doing. And so what we're really just doing is learning how to do this formally with all the words, the fancy definitions, and then we're learning how to do this on the computer with data that we're getting from the outside. But it's good that you have some exposure to data collection and usage, because that's going to be really important in making sure you can utilize these skills. There was one comment that said the data on Africans is statistically unfavorable, usually a negative description of the social or economic environment. And so one thing that we'll talk about, or one thing that we won't talk about, but you should be aware of in research, is that at the end of the day, there's always motives. And so in the US, when people write research papers, it's generally common for them to talk about who's funding them, who they're doing the research for, whether there's a conflict of interest. And so the general idea behind that is the cigarettes to smoke are bad for your health. So if you're doing a research on whether or not the cigarettes are healthy for you, if the cigarette company is funding that research, it's going to be biased. And so in the case of African countries, I think the data is definitely biased because of these reasons. We know that there's historical and even continuing relationship between African countries and former colonial powers, new places in the world that want to try to take advantage of Africa, whether it's make sure that they're producing the agricultural goods they want, they're exporting the raw resources that they want. They don't want the country to develop in a certain way because that affects their money. And that idea, that paradigm dictates the kind of data that's done or the data that's collected on African countries. That dictates the way that it just dictates a lot of things. And so it makes it really hard to objectively see what's really going on in Cameroon and African countries in general. For example, one thing I can give is when you look at statistics on how we measure economy in comparison, like from the US to Cameroon, for example, in the US, it could be easy. While there's a lot of complications, if you think about things, in the case of Cameroon, you don't have a debt system, whereas in the US, you have debt system. And so in the US, you may have a perceived higher quality of life or things may look better. But if you owe money on average to people, compared to in Cameroon, you don't owe anyone money, those are things you have to take into account. If in the US, people don't own land, people own land in Cameroon, you have to take that into account. If people are growing food in Cameroon, maybe it's not enough food, maybe it's not the amount of food they want to eat or the amount of food that's needed. If you're not including those numbers and economic output, that makes a big effect. And so these are all things we have to think about when it comes to data and how it's collected on Africans for sure. And then even some of the numbers, because these numbers dictate a lot of things. It dictates how much debt the countries can take out, which dictates how well the economy is doing. Because if you have numbers that aren't accurate, and based on those numbers, you're taking out loans with high interest rate that the country has to pay back, you have a big problem. And so we have to think about where all this data is coming from. Are there conflicts of interest? Is there anything going on behind the scenes? Could the data be improved? These are all questions that are important for us to think about. Does anyone have any other comments on these? Or have any comments related to these? How well do you think civil servants are trained to work with data, in your opinion?
I actually think the government has, like, they try actually to inculcate data collection and its usage in the curriculum, both undergraduate, graduate, and even the training of civil servants. Because before you graduate from any university and any training professional school here in Cameroon, you have to write maybe like a thesis or a project. And before you are able to complete this, you have to gather some information, and you actually have to give out surveys, questionnaires to people to actually get back to you, and you have to include this in your project. However, I don't think this is often very effective because people don't actually carry out these surveys, and they just get any information and include it in their projects. But there is an attempt to make sure that every Cameroonian, before he or she reaches any level, should be able to collect data and should be able to make use of that data. Yeah.
Yes, that's a really, really good requirement, because a lot of these skills in relation to data, analyzing data, come from experience. You'll see throughout the evolution of how training works that no matter how much information we get, people can be trained to do something in 4 years, because ultimately knowledge is cumulative. So if you look at the computer, it took hundreds of years, for example, of theory, studying mathematics, to be able to figure out that regression works. But you can start way ahead and just say, we're going to learn regression. And so I think people get caught up too much in thinking about learning how things work instead of getting a basic understanding and then get experience. So I think having that requirement that people do the thesis is very, very good, because it forces students to become active in the data collection, data analyzing process. And the more that we incorporate those kind of things into education, the better trained that people are going to be. And having better trained people with computational social science, you don't want just civil servants who know this information. You want normal people, everyday population to know these things, because the everyday population has to vote. They have to understand issues that are going on in the country. They have to understand the flows of the data. They want to be aware of when a company may be taking advantage of their data. You want to give them the ability to say, hey, there's a problem in the market and I'm trained to know data and I think I can come up with a better approach for this than this other company. And so those are all important reasons as to why all people should have these skills, especially the youth. So that's it for our scheduled time. So we'll go ahead and end this session and then begin again on Monday. And when we begin on Monday, that will be in person and we'll be covering specific methods that we'll be using in computational social science. So before we go, does anybody have any questions or things they want to discuss in relation to data, the Cameroon context, the Africa context, or the ethics? If not, I thank you all for joining. I hope you all have a good night and I look forward to meeting you all in person on Monday. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was great.
Thank you. Okay, I will see everybody later.